faithfully delivering value, interpreting great books from around the world. Hi, this is Sally's Book Talk. Last episode, I covered the second volume of The Glory and the Dream. Today, we're starting the third volume, but first, a quick recap of the last episode. I talked about American history from 1941 to 1950. During that decade, the U.S. led the Allies to final victory. After the war, people's pent-up consumer desire exploded instantly, thrusting America into a consumer society. Meanwhile, the U.S.'s international status soared rapidly, and it entered a full-scale confrontation with the Soviet Union, kicking off the Cold War. Domestically, McCarthyism rose to prominence, spreading Red Scare feverishly, persecuting many innocents, making everyone fearful. Now, we move into the third volume of The Glory and the Dream, covering another 10 years. From 1951 to 1960, first, I'll unravel the mystery left from the last episode, telling how McCarthyism plummeted from its arrogant peak to complete ruin. McCarthyism's rise to its zenith is tied to a major political event, MacArthur's dismissal. On April 10, 1951, President Truman ordered the removal of MacArthur from all his duties. Why did he make this decision? The reason is, since the Chinese People's Volunteers joined the war, the U.S. forces suffered repeated defeats in Korea, being pushed back south of the 38th parallel. This embarrassed MacArthur, who had boasted about conquering all of Korea. With no gains on the front, MacArthur became all talk. He unilaterally held a press conference, demanding the U.S. government send more troops, allow him to bomb Northeast China, and even use atomic bombs, which infuriated Truman. According to Truman's policy, the Korean War was localized and had to be confined to the Korean Peninsula. If it went beyond that, the Soviet Union might join, sparking a world war, which the U.S. government didn't want. By 1951, Truman was ready for peace talks, but MacArthur's big mouth disrupted his plans. What's worse, MacArthur, relying on his military achievements, ignored Truman. He kept spouting nonsense several times. Warnings didn't work, so a frustrated Truman had to fire him. However, Truman didn't expect that this move not only dealt a heavy blow to his reputation, but also dragged down America during the Democratic era. McCarthyism was in full swing, and a large group fiercely counterattacked, portraying MacArthur, who fought communist forces in Korea, as an anti-communist hero. At this point, Truman fired him, and in many people's eyes, he instantly became a villain aiding tyranny. The White House received tens of thousands of letters and telegrams, all cursing Truman. Gallup polls showed that nearly 70% of the public supported MacArthur, while Truman's popularity hit rock bottom. McCarthy seized the opportunity to rush to the Senate and deliver a speech. He praised MacArthur as a hero and cursed Truman as a son of a bitch. Immediately after, he escalated the rhetoric. He launched an attack on the entire foreign policy of the Democratic administration. McCarthy's target was Marshall. During World War II, Roosevelt appointed Marshall as Army Chief of Staff, overseeing everything. Truman also trusted Marshall deeply, making him Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State, his right-hand man. To achieve his goal, McCarthy resorted to every possible means of defamation. He claimed that during World War II, Marshall repeatedly delayed the opening of a second front by the U.S. As a result, the Soviet Union seized the initiative and controlled Eastern Europe. After the war, Marshall, entrusted by Truman, went to China to mediate, only to lose the entire mainland China. Even the U.S. military's failure in the Korean War was blamed on Marshall. In short, in McCarthy's words, Marshall was a heinous conspirator, almost directly calling him a Soviet spy. Marshall couldn't defend himself and eventually resigned in disgrace, leaving politics. Gallup polls showed that after Marshall's resignation, Truman's approval rating continued to drop, hitting a low of 23% at its worst. This number was even lower than Nixon's after the Watergate scandal, showing how bad Truman's reputation had become. Thus, the Democrats were severely weakened, making it unlikely for them to continue governing. Meanwhile, the Republicans' momentum grew stronger. In the upcoming presidential election, the Republicans managed to bring out a big figure, Eisenhower. During World War II, Eisenhower served as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, directing key campaigns like the North Africa landings and D-Day. After the war, he became president of Columbia University and Supreme Commander of NATO forces, deeply beloved both at home and abroad. Politically, Eisenhower leaned conservative, believing in the power of the market and not agreeing with Roosevelt's New Deal. At the same time, he advocated for a tougher stance against the Soviet Union. These were very close to the Republican platform, so both sides hit it off immediately. Eisenhower was nominated by the Republicans as their presidential candidate. Now, at the end of 1952, he smoothly ascended to the presidency. From his official inauguration in 1953 to his retirement in 1960, the master of the White House was always Eisenhower, ushering American history into the Eisenhower era. In 1953, when Eisenhower took office, McCarthy launched over 600 investigations and frequently broadcast hearings live, creating a huge uproar. As the author of this book puts it, McCarthy reached the peak of his life. However, the truth of life is that when someone gets carried away with success, what awaits them is a fall to the bottom, known as peak followed by decline. McCarthy didn't notice that the situation was quietly changing. First, from the government level, although Eisenhower was conservative in stance, he was upright in character and inwardly opposed to McCarthy's methods, and there was an opportunity during the campaign. McCarthy came to show support, and the photographer asked them to embrace for a photo, but Eisenhower refused. Through this detail, he showed that he and McCarthy were not the same kind of people. McCarthy's actions also angered the Republican Party. Democrats, when they were in power, he attacked the government for being full of Soviet spies, which helped the Republicans. Now that the Republicans are in power, he's still stubbornly digging for spies. Isn't that rude? McCarthy also reached into the military, wanting to investigate the army, which infuriated Eisenhower, and among the Republican upper echelons, there was a move to get rid of him. The idea of getting rid of McCarthy began to sprout. Meanwhile, societal attitudes were changing. In March 1953, Soviet leader Stalin died. Soon after, the Korean War armistice was signed, and Americans breathed a sigh of relief, feeling they could finally live in peace. But McCarthy was still hyping up the Red Scare, which became annoying. Some people began to reflect, were we fooled by this guy? At this point, someone stepped forward to publicly express doubts. He was Edward Murrow in America. Murrow was one of the most influential media figures. After the outbreak of World War II, he was among the first to report from Europe to the American people. During World War II, when the Nazis were bombing London fiercely, Murrow ignored the danger, climbed to the roof of the BBC to broadcast the situation live. This act set a benchmark for all journalists and earned Murrow many fans. After the war, Murrow hosted a news program on CBS with high ratings. Murrow did not agree with McCarthyism and criticized it early on, for which he faced great pressure. Listeners wrote letters cursing him, and his boss demanded he stay silent to avoid offending big clients. Murrow did not compromise. In March 1954, he produced an episode that provided a detailed analysis of McCarthy's tactics. Murrow pointed out that McCarthy's accusations lacked substantial evidence. He relied on distorting materials, scaremongering, and creating a climate of terror. This behavior of ignoring evidence and fabricating claims trampled on the American judicial system. The episode sparked strong reactions, persuading many to doubt McCarthy. If Murrah shifted public sentiment, Joseph Welch delivered the fatal blow. Who was Welch? He was a special counsel for the U.S. Army Department. As mentioned earlier, McCarthy's meddling in military affairs provoked backlash. At the Army's request, the Senate held hearings in April 1954 to investigate McCarthy. Initially, McCarthy was arrogant and domineering, while Welch remained silent, listening quietly. On the ninth day, he struck. Welch produced a confidential letter from the FBI. He demanded to know how McCarthy obtained the secret letter. McCarthy froze. His clearance level barred FBI from sharing classified intel with him. Under Welch's grilling, McCarthy admitted he stole it, an illegal act. That day, the hearing aired live, watched by 20 million people. They witnessed McCarthy's illegal schemes and saw him humiliated for the first time. Over subsequent days, Welch dismantled McCarthy's tricks. Quote mining, photo doctoring, rumor spreading, and framing. People were stunned. A seemingly powerful man crumbled when exposed. Defenseless. Toppling a villain proved unexpectedly simple. Post-hearing, McCarthy's positions were stripped one by one. In December 1954, the Senate passed a censure resolution, 67-22. McCarthy was utterly disgraced. He died depressed. Years later, McCarthyism, which plagued America for years, finally fizzled out. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief as society regained vitality. The 5 years from McCarthyism's collapse to Eisenhower's departure are considered America's golden age, marked by unprecedented consumer power. After the war, the U.S. economy boomed, and Americans' incomes kept growing. From 1945 to 1955, average American household income increased by 48%. Thus, over 1 million farmers moved to cities yearly for work. Their incomes rose even faster, boosting Americans' purchasing power across the board. Before, blue-collar workers could only afford basic Ford cars, but now they could buy pricier automobiles. The workers also got chances to invest in stocks, once a rich person's privilege. More importantly, white-collar workers were rising. In 1956, U.S. white-collar workers outnumbered blue-collar for the first time, a landmark moment. From then on, office workers outnumbered factory workers in America. This pattern never reversed, and manufacturing kept shrinking as an employer. Today's worry about manufacturing hollowing out actually began half a century ago, but back then, people cheered because white-collar growth brought vibrant prosperity. Now, I'll highlight 2 key aspects. First, shifts in spending habits and money attitudes. Compared to farmers and laborers, white-collar workers were bigger spenders and quicker to adopt new trends. By the mid-1950s, cars, fridges, radios, and TVs were household staples, nothing special. White-collar folks turned to new gadgets like vacuums, air conditioning units, electric blankets, and washer dryers. Booming advertising stoked their buying urges even more. Actually, Americans mastered advertising early. Founding father Benjamin Franklin was an ad genius. When you launched the Pennsylvania Gazette, its debut front page featured not news, but a soap ad. That earned Franklin the title Father of American Advertising. With the founder championing it, the industry's future glowed bright. In the early 20th century, as radios filled American homes, businesses slid ads into broadcasts. By the 1950s, TV became advertisers' new darling. From lipstick and beer to razors and painkillers, ads flooded TV screens, packaging products as irresistible temptations. Where'd ordinary folks get all that cash? Installment plans emerged, and like ads, they were nothing new to Americans. Back then, to boost sales, both Ford and General Motors offered installment plans. By 1924, half of all private cars were already bought on installment. And by 1956, buying cars through installments became instinctive for Americans. Nearly all private cars were purchased this way. The auto industry's success spurred other businesses to follow suit. From sofas to yachts, virtually anything you could think of could be bought in installments. Advertising overload plus installment plans created a full consumer logic. Ads fueled buying desires. To satisfy endless new cravings, people increasingly used installments, fundamentally reshaping Americans' money mindset. German sociologist Max Weber proposed that hard work, saving, and reinvesting, not just spending, fueled rapid capital expansion. This view was called the Protestant work ethic. Since most Americans were Protestants, the U.S. was seen as its prime example. In the past, America truly valued thrift and saving. But now that changed. From 1952 to 1956, U.S. installment credit grew 63%, while consumer debt rose 55%. America became a debt society, where everyone owed money. Accordingly, Americans lost interest in saving. Even wealthy households in places like Long Island averaged just $300 in savings. Amid this trend, the Protestant ethic seemed outdated. A popular advertising jingle perfectly captured Americans' shifting attitude. It urged, buy, 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 get what you need today, prompting immediate spending and loans when cash strapped. Thus, thrift wasn't a virtue anymore. Instant gratification ruled. This money mindset didn't just boost everyday spending, it supercharged the entertainment industry. In the 1950s, U.S. entertainment boomed, producing megastars like Marilyn Monroe and rock icon Elvis. First, let's talk about Marilyn Monroe. Born in L.A., she was discovered at 20 by Hollywood giant 21st Century Fox and starred in multiple films. With her sexy appearance and bold performances, Marilyn Monroe quickly rose to fame. Her most iconic scene is in the movie The 7-Year Itch, standing over a subway grate as the wind blows her skirt up. This scene is rated as one of the sexiest moments in film history. Thus, Monroe became the dream girl for American men. Monroe's private life was also filled with legendary stories. She was married to Arthur Miller, a playwright who wrote the classic play Death of a Salesman. This marriage caused a sensation, but ended tragically. Monroe had 2 miscarriages, and they divorced in 1961. Monroe also had many lovers throughout her life. Among them was future U.S. President John F. Kennedy. Their affair was widely rumored and became gossip for Americans. While Monroe's fans were mostly adult men, Elvis Presley targeted the teenage market. Elvis Presley, originally named Elvis Presley, worked as a truck driver and loved rock and roll. And in 1956, Elvis starred in the movie Love Me Tender as a supporting role. Though his screen time was limited, he became the highlight of the film with his 4 songs. With the movie's theme song Love Me Tender sweeping across America, Elvis became hugely popular and rose to the ranks of top singers. He was only 21 at the time. Elvis's singles and albums sold massively, often exceeding 1 million copies, a feat unprecedented in rock music history. Thus, Elvis was the first rock superstar, becoming famous before the Beatles. Elvis's fans were mainly teenagers, especially girls. These girls would attend his concerts wherever he performed, find excuses to send him gifts, and chase his car on motorcycles. Some young girls even carved his name on their arms with pencils. Therefore, Elvis's fame signaled that teenagers had become the main force in the American consumer market, with the social reason being the post-war baby boom generation. By the late 1950s, they had just entered adolescence. They were restless inside, craving excitement, and willing to spend lavishly on idols. And their parents, with substantial incomes, could afford their children's spending. And interestingly, the same phenomenon is now seen in China. In terms of craziness, today Gen Z's obsession with little fresh meat idols is no less intense than American Girl's infatuation with Elvis, and the reasons are similar. Gen Z is in their adolescence, chasing trends, and their families are relatively wealthy, able to support their idol worship. No wonder the old saying goes, there's nothing new under the sun. And it's true. Today's things happening around us, Americans experienced over half a century ago. Now back to Elvis. In 1958, Elvis joined the army and was stationed at a U.S. military camp in Germany. Elvis's arrival caused a sensation in Europe with media coverage everywhere. Along with him came Hollywood movies, jazz, Coca-Cola, and KFC. They became wildly popular in Europe and snowballed from Britain and France to Africa and South America, flooding the world with American goods and pop culture. Americans seized the chance to say, why can we produce such abundant goods? It's because we're free and open. Ultimately, it's thanks to the American-style democratic system. This narrative had a huge impact. One could say the late 1950s was the first peak of Americans exporting pop culture and democratic systems. So, through this export, the U.S. built an international image of freedom, civilization, and wealth, but it also invited trouble. How to understand this? The author of this book writes, American standard of living is so high that other countries can't grasp it, not just in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but even old developed nations like Britain and France are envious. You people admired it while accumulating resentment. Some believe Americans' wealth is based on plundering global resources. Millions of Africans starving are a result of this exploitation. Others think Americans constantly flaunt their wealth, making developing countries look inferior, which itself creates suffering. Moreover, to counter the Soviet Union, the U.S. supported dictatorships everywhere, contradicting its proclaimed ideals of democracy and freedom, making it even more resented. In short, to many nations' people, Americans build happiness on others' suffering, and the U.S. is the root of pain. Under this sentiment, anti-American movements erupted in many places, with U.S. embassies frequently attacked, making the late 1950s the first peak of anti-American waves. Here's an example. In the spring of 1958, U.S. Vice President Nixon visited South America, and in Caracas, Venezuela, he was nearly killed. The incident unfolded as follows. According to the itinerary, after landing, Nixon would go from the airport to the tomb of Bolivar, the hero who liberated South America and father of Venezuela, to lay a wreath. Nixon thought this activity would be easy, but he didn't expect that anti-American elements had already organized. Along the way, the motorcade was constantly attacked. Protesters wielding sticks, iron pipes, and even axes smashed Nixon's car, shattering the windows and sending glass flying, nearly injuring Nixon. Helpless, Nixon took refuge in the U.S. Embassy, surrounded by thousands of protesters in a highly tense situation. When news reached America, Eisenhower was shocked. He immediately dispatched aircraft carriers and missile cruisers to pressure Venezuela and ordered the Marines to prepare. Fortunately, Nixon kept a clear head, believing this would only further enrage anti-American elements. He dissuaded Eisenhower, quickly communicated with the Venezuelan government, and finally returned home safely. Despite the dangers of Nixon's South America trip, Americans weren't overly concerned since Venezuela's power posed no fatal threat to the U.S. America's real concern was the Soviet Union, its greatest competitor. After the Cold War began, the U.S. and USSR vied for dominance worldwide. In the 1950s, this rivalry entered a new phase, the space race. The trigger came after Stalin's death when Khrushchev became Soviet leader. Knowing he couldn't compete with Americans on living standards, he chose a different breakthrough point: artificial satellites. On October 4th, 1957, the USSR launched humanity's first artificial satellite, followed by a second a month later. This shocked American society. Media sensationalized that two Soviet satellites now hung overhead, exposing every U.S. move to Soviet eyes, terrifying Americans. The military grew more anxious, speculating satellite launches required massive thrust. Clearly, the Soviets already had intercontinental missiles. If they could launch satellites today, tomorrow they could fit nukes and strike U.S. soil, while America's missiles were still in development. As a precaution, U.S. Strategic Air Command ordered B-52 bombers armed with nukes to patrol 24/7, ready to retaliate. Thus, fear and anxiety engulfed America, with calming public nerves becoming the top priority. The Eisenhower administration decided to launch its own satellite immediately, scheduling it for 1957. On December 6th, schools and factories closed as people eagerly awaited. The Associated Press had pre-written press releases sent to major media outlets. Many newspapers even preset their layouts, just waiting to print. But the satellite-carrying rocket veered off course immediately after launch, crashing and burning in the launch area. With their boasting so exaggerated, the failure backfired into a PR disaster. Americans became the world's laughingstock, while Soviets gloated with schadenfreude. Still, Americans didn't lose heart over this temporary space race setback. They remained confident in their culture and system. Of course, this didn't mean America lacked internal crises. Despite overall prosperity, discord emerged in the late 1950s, most notably the Civil Rights Movement, symbolized by the Little Rock Crisis. Black rights in America are a complex socio-historical issue. As early as 1861, North and South went to war over this, costing over 600,000 lives. After the Civil War, slavery was legally abolished, but laws couldn't erase white discrimination against blacks. Discrimination against blacks spread nationwide, especially severe in the slavery-practicing South. Southern states invented a policy called separate but equal. But what did that really mean? Didn't constitutional amendments guarantee equality regardless of race or skin color? Fine. They'd separate whites and blacks into parallel worlds. See? Equal treatment. For example, whites in white schools, blacks in black schools, whites in white stores, blacks in black stores, even segregated train cars. This so-called equality was transparent discrimination in disguise. Under this principle, black facilities were vastly inferior to white ones. For instance, white public schools had ample funding and strong faculty, while black schools struggled with poor funding, shabby buildings, and far worse education. Thus, in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled separate but equal in public schools unconstitutional. States must immediately integrate black and white students. This ruling sparked fierce backlash in southern states, especially Arkansas, leading to the nationally shocking Little Rock crisis. In the summer of 1957, a public high school in Little Rock, Arkansas's capital, prepared to admit 9 high-achieving black students. This move was resisted by Governor Falvis, who gave a televised speech publicly questioning the Supreme Court's ruling and threatening to deploy the state National Guard to block the black students. On September 2nd, the black students arrived at the public high school as scheduled, only to be blocked by the state National Guard. White racists who heard the news came to hurl insults and harass them, forcing the students to leave. At this point, it was no longer just about racial discrimination. It had become a case of the state government openly defying the Constitution and disregarding the Supreme Court's ruling. At this point, President Eisenhower had to intervene. On September 23rd, Eisenhower delivered a televised address promising to use all legal means to uphold the federal Constitution. Marks Kavanaugh. He then ordered the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock to escort the black students. Under military pressure, Falvis was forced to compromise. The black students successfully entered the school. In hindsight, the Little Rock crisis was a precursor to the Civil Rights Movement and a landmark event. However, its immediate impact shouldn't be overstated, as it didn't immediately change social attitudes. In America, anti-Black discrimination remains strong in the South. A clear example is that after the Little Rock crisis, Governor Faubus's popularity didn't decline, it actually rose. One-third of Southerners saw him as a hero. Afterward, Faubus was re-elected governor multiple times, holding power for 12 consecutive years before retiring, showing how entrenched white racists were. Substantive progress in the civil rights movement wouldn't come until the mid-1960s. In November 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected U.S. president, ending the Eisenhower era. To summarize his 8-year presidency, it can be said that Eisenhower's greatest contribution was ending McCarthyism and revitalizing America. American culture and systems were also exported on a large scale during this period. Two major trends emerged in his later years: the escalation of U.S.-Soviet rivalry and the rise of the civil rights movement. These two trends would shape America's path in the next decade, which we'll cover in the next episode. All right, that concludes Volume 3 of The Glory and the Dream. Keynotes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.